It's about utilizing your management system to return to work safely. So I hope you're all okay out there. Hope the sun's shining wherever you are. And without further ado, we'll get stuck into this webinar. Hope you enjoy it. There we are, first blip of the webinar, but it's working now. So my name's Martin Little. I'm NQA's Field Operations Manager for our Southern region. And today I'm joined by my fellow panelist, Terry Fisher, who's our Principal Assessor for Occupational Health and Safety, which you can see from the details there. Oh, say hello,
Terry.
Everybody.
Hello, everybody. I hope you're all well, keeping safe.
Good. Well, the attendees is going up, so yeah, good stuff. Both been with NQA for a number of years, and we both cover a wide variety of standards. So hopefully we've got a good idea what we're talking about. Hopefully the webinar will be about 20 minutes. If you do have any questions, please post them into the chat box, because that way both Terry and myself can see them. If we have any questions that are pertinent to the section of the presentation that we're in, we might answer them then and there. And if not, we'll leave them to the Q&A session at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and at the completion of the webinar, these slides will be emailed out to you all. And if anybody missed the webinar or want to, review what was said and discussed, then a link to the recording of this webinar will also be provided. NQA has also produced a guidance document for returning to work, which sort of summarizes the points of this webinar, and that will soon be available, hopefully on our website, but it will also be emailed out along with the slides and the link to the recording. So I hope that's okay for you all. Right, so a bit of an overview as to the things we're going to cover today. Who are NQA? If you're new to NQA, then the next slide will give you all the genuine information on who we are and what we do and where we do it in the world. And we'll then cover the purpose of the webinar, structural changes that might be required by your management system, process changes to think about when planning your return to work, hopefully safely and effectively, and then a bit of information at the end about NQA's new COVID secure product, which is a verification that we can offer to see how prepared you are for returning to work. And then at the end, we have the traditional question and answer section. So here we go. Here's NQA in a nutshell. So our purpose is to help our customers deliver products that the world can trust. We're a world-leading certification body with global operations. We specialize in certification in high technology and engineering sectors. We're #1 in America for aerospace. We're in the top 3 for the UK and Ireland for 9, 14, 45,001, 27,001, the traditional core of the standards. Globally, we're #1 for telecommunications and automotive. Globally, #3 for aerospace, and #2 in the UK and Ireland for aerospace. And we're #1 in China for automotive. So all those little orange dots is where you'll find us. So, yep, that's NQA in a nutshell. We've been doing what we've been doing for over 30 plus years. So we're a trusted source, a trusted provider, 50,000 global certificates, and our fees are 100% inclusive. So the price that you're quoted is the price that you pay with no additional expenses on top. 1,000 plus employees worldwide, operating in 90 countries, and our average customer partnership is 10 years. So yeah, impressive stuff. So the purpose of today's webinar, what's it about? As it said at the opening slide, utilizing your management system to help you to return to work. And why are we having this webinar? Why are we having this conversation? And it's because businesses have changed significantly and dramatically in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you've not heard about that, then you've been lucky. So we want to help you survive and ensure that organisations can continue operating during the pandemic within the associated restrictions. As organisations start to plan their return to work, they'll be reviewing the tools available to them to make the changes necessary to operate an effective and a safe organisation. And obviously your management system is one of the core tools to allow you to do that. The webinar is designed to highlight some areas of change that you may have to make to your management system so it can support the fundamentals of your business and allow all of you to return to work safely for everybody that can be potentially affected by your activities. We've broken these potential changes down into hopefully bite-sized chunks, and we've based them around the sections of the ISO standard. So that's what we're going to cover this afternoon. So fortunately for us, the ISO standards work in a logical, progressive way. They follow the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, PDCA as it's also known, and that allows us to work in a very systematic way. Following the COVID-19 outbreak, we'll have to return to the beginning from when we first set up our management systems and our organizations and look at what changes may need to be made in a post-COVID society. The good news is that if you already have a management system that's based on the ISO standards, you should already have the processes in place that will allow you to manage these changes effectively. So let's begin at the beginning with the basics. Section 4, the context of the organization. So laying the foundations, the bedrock for your management system. What are the issues that your organization faces both internally and externally? All of those issues have interested parties. Who are they? Have they changed at all following the COVID-19 pandemic? And indeed, if there are any changes, do you need to revisit the scope of your management system to make sure that it's still on the money? So beginning at the beginning with the context. As soon as we've got that, we can move into leadership and start involving top management at the earliest stage, the very first step of implementing any changes that we might need to. At the end of the day, top management is accountable for the effectiveness of the management system, so they've got to be on board. Must ensure that all required changes are made to the management system. This is something that top management has to drive. And when the changes are made, they should be incorporated into the day-to-day running of the processes. So ideally, nothing special, nothing extra should be needed to operate a safe and effective organization. The resources needed to do just that are made available at the right time to the right people, and that the right people are aware of the roles and responsibilities that they have for performing these day-to-day activities within the scope of the business's processes. So all of these things can potentially change following COVID-19. Section 6, planning, risks and opportunities that are facing the management system. Are they reviewed? Are there any new ones? If they are they suitably identified? The actions to mitigate these risks and to indeed realise any opportunities that are also being presented. Are these actions suitably defined and being realised? And then the overall objectives of the organisation. Do these need to be realigned to the new reality that we're now having to face on a day-to-day basis? It's around section 6 where change starts to show up in the standards, and once all of the above has been done, then the planning for making these changes can begin. And again, as I said already, this has to be driven by top management. If it's not driven by top management, then the management of the resources needed for your organization to return to work safely might not be there. So really is key. Section 7, the support resources, we've already mentioned these need to be in place. So do the correct people, infrastructure and environment to make sure that everyone can return to work safely, that the people within the organisation have the knowledge, the awareness and the competence to work safely and effectively within the organisation, and that effective channels of communication are in place, and that any documentation that needs to be in place is put in place and deployed effectively within the organisation. Section 8 is the doing, it's the operation, and if we've done everything up to this point correctly and properly, then it should more or less take care of itself. It should more or less meet your expectations and meet the requirements, but it needs to be monitored and measured effectively to make sure that it is working as planned. And indeed, that's what Section 9 is all about. So how do you need to monitor and measure your performance once you've returned to work? What's key? How are you going to do this? Internal audits are a wonderful tool for monitoring the performance of your organization. So please deploy internal audits effectively in a timely manner in line with risk. And then report the results back to top management, again, via management review, so they can see how well all of the changes that are being deployed within the business have been realized. So we're coming full circle now and into section 10, which is improvement. So based on all the things that you've seen, all the things that you've monitored and measured, then you can drive improvement where it's necessary. So that's a very quick overview of the sections of the standard. And what we're going to do now is go into them in a bit more detail. Obviously, the standards are written for everybody and every kind of organization all around the world. So the standards aren't specific. You make them specific to your own organization. So the next few sections are a bit more generic in nature. But to make them a bit easier to review, we've color-coded them. Black sections will cover all standards. Red is health and safety, green is environment and energy, and blue is quality. So hopefully these sections will give you a few thoughts to mull over. So it's at this point that I'm going to hand over to Terry, and Terry will take you through the next few slides.
Hi everybody. Just to clarify there, if you do have any questions, by all means type them into the questions and chat boxes that are available within your presentation, and then, as we say, we'll either try and answer them as we go, or we'll save them up for the end for the Q&A session at the end. But feel free to ask any questions, but you must bear in mind we're not consultants. We can't give you company specific answers. We can only talk in generic terms about system requirements and requirements of standards, etc., etc. Right. So, context. The thing about context, it isn't a static thing, especially in these ever-changing times. You know, sort of January, February, most organisations were carrying on doing what they're doing, and then in March, all of a sudden, I think the context for almost every organisation changed in some way, shape, or form. So it's a very dynamic thing, is the context, and it is subject to change. So it's a matter of being aware of those changes and identifying the various needs. So you need to consider internal requirements, so your workers, the management and the organisation itself. It has its needs, so they would be classed as internal. You also get external issues, so you've got, for example, enforcement issues and enforcement agencies. Your customers, your suppliers, all external, all need to be considered. So the supplier relationship can be a very interesting one in these challenging times, because you will expect things to be, no doubt, delivered to your organisation. So arrangements need to be agreed and how that's going to work. And you need to look at how your interested parties, who they are, and if any of those have changed significantly, because there may be some new ones in there. And it could be down to regulatory requirements or different changes in local arrangements for you. I think the key thing to remember is change is almost constant. And this is where, in the context of the organisation, we're trying to identify why are we doing things, who we're doing them for, and how do we know we've delivered them effectively? That's the embodiment of the context of the organisation. Have we completely identified all the wants and needs and expectations of the interested parties? You may want to re-look at your SWOT and PESTEL analysis and review them and update them accordingly. It may actually impact on the scope of the management system. You may not be doing what you traditionally did prior to the COVID-19 outbreak. You know, a lot of organisations have changed into providing different services and different products in response to the COVID-19. So has that had an impact on your scope and your operations, etc., for your management system? And have you checked that all the relevant clauses of the standard, if you have any exclusions, remain suitably not applicable? Because that can be an important thing. You may look at design, for example. You may have said it was limited applicability prior to, but you've changed what you do and how you do it, and therefore it may have had an impact on any not fully applicable clauses within the management standard. So it's really important that you understand how the management system is there to help and support your activities. It's not there as a hindrance. And now is not the time to sort of kick your management system into the long grass because you're too busy. Now is the time that you should really be relying on your management system to enable you to do things in a structured and organised manner to ensure that things don't get missed off. And then there's all the documentation and information in the management system detail of above. They may need some revision or some updates. Think about, you may be adopting new methods of communication, new methods of communicating information. So think about that. It isn't all just traditional hard copy documents as we go. So next slide, please. Section 5, leadership. So if the context and all these things have been updated and we know what we're about and why we're doing things, have we got everything in place? Have we got all the processes? Do we need to revise any of our processes? Do we need to look at the scope and how we deliver those requirements? Do we need to look at additional resources, whether that be just manpower or whether that be completely new processes for new products and services? It will all be very much down to each individual organisation what impact this has on them. It could be that, you know, we're now all working remotely. I mean, NQA ourselves have had a lot of changes in terms of working remotely, and that's applicable to a lot of organisations, I think, in the last few months. And that can bring its own challenges and its own rewards. So there's some positives and negatives, as with all these things. But you really need to, the leadership need to look at how this is going to be done and what needs to be done and what they need to put in place to enable it to be achieved. Do we need to assign any new roles and responsibilities to people? Because that may change. The structure of an organisation may change due to unavailability of resource. You may have some key staff and some key personnel that are no longer directly available to the organisation for various health reasons or other considerations. So it may be an impact there that you need to look at various roles and understand, okay, then if that's not going to be done by them, who's it going to be done by? Who needs to take responsibility for various things? So all these things need to be looked at and reviewed and confirmed. Some of the changes that you make may be short term and only valid for the resulting COVID-19, however long that may be. But it may be that some of the changes that you implement are actually long-term changes. It gives you an opportunity to implement something that you thought would be a good idea in the long term anyway. So there are some positives in the COVID-19 framework that have proved really useful for a lot of organisations. It isn't all negative. I think the one thing to reiterate here is the communication at all levels within the organisation. Communication and effective communication is a really key element, both in terms of getting engagement with workers and interested parties generally, But without effective communication, you're going to cause a lot of problems, a lot of issues. So think about, in terms of communication, what you're doing, how you're going to communicate that. How can you confirm that what you intended the message to be is that's what it was interpreted as? A lot of the time it can come down to interpretation. You know, is texting a suitable method for communicating with everybody? It may be okay for some, but it may not be okay for others. So think about the method of communication as well. It's really important there throughout. And changes in policy, have they been documented? Have they been thought about? You may have to have revised policies in terms of, okay, you know, working remotely, for example. You may have to define new policies about working remotely and how you're going to support or whatever staff and interested parties through the various things, what you're going to do, what you're able to do, what you can't do, etc., etc. And all this is, to some extent, can be an ever-changing profile on the business. But it needs to, you need to engage with that process and make sure that the workforce is aware of new policies and the people that the policies are applied to. So it can involve clients, providers, support agencies, etc., etc. Next slide, please. So section 6, we've looked briefly at risks and opportunities, and we talked about those in earlier sections. Risks and opportunities, both in terms of, you know, there are new risks to people and individuals, but there's also commercial and strategic risks and opportunities. We could do something new. We could be providing a new service that maybe have its own challenges in terms of working practices, etc. But it could also be very rewarding in terms of doing something new. Could actually be a springboard for a long-term change in direction. So try and keep some positives in the realms of all of this. There's a lot going on, but you really need to look at some positives. The management system is there to try and stop you being overwhelmed by all the changes. So looking at the risks and the opportunities, so you need to look at the prioritization of these, what you need to do now, what's nice to have. The nice to haves can probably wait. If it's a risk to people and strategic direction of the business, I would suggest it probably can't wait and you need to do something about it relatively quickly. So it's about considering those and considering that priorities as you go. That in itself may have changed the organization's goals and objectives in terms of what you do and how you do it and what you want to achieve. So again, that can be a critical review of looking at, has anything significantly changed? Also, the ownership of those goals and objectives and those requirements. The same people may not be available within your organization. You may not have the same influence over various things. So it's about reviewing all of that as you go. Another important element here is business continuity. What if things don't work out as you planned, or things aren't available as you expected them to be, or you get a negative test result when you do some measuring and various things, the reactions in the business continuity, or you have a serious breakdown of plant and equipment, etc. All these things are influenced by the current COVID-19 potentially. So it's really about looking at your continuity and the suitable considerations of emergency preparedness and the various things related to that. On an environmental front, you know, the shutdown will have impacted on your energy usage if you're heavily involved in 50001. So you may have to do an energy baseline review based on the revised throughput or whatever, and have you got all the data for that to enable you to do that effectively. Next slide, please. Are there any new environmental impacts and aspects? Has the significance of existing impacts and aspects and impacts changed, as in the frequency and likelihood of the scale of the operations, etc.? There'll be a lot of dynamics in there that you need to consider within your management system. Going back to a general one again, does the organisation have any new or revised compliance obligations? These may not all be statutory and legal requirements. A lot of organisations are aligned to trade associations and customer requirements. A lot of these customer requirements are changing, requirements for deliveries, interested parties, service providers, suppliers. Trade associations, they're making recommendations to do things slightly differently. And if your service is aligned to some of those trade associations, you might to reconsider some of those. Has all the new legislation been suitably identified and considered for actions and taken to ensure compliance? So it's not about just implementing the changes that you think are appropriate, but you have to then confirm that they'll be able to deliver what you think they're going to do. They're going to deliver that compliance. It's a really important element of the statutory obligations and the compliance obligations that you look at how you're going to measure and indicate how that compliance has been achieved. On the environmental side, that could be something as straightforward as an environmental permit. And on the health and safety side, it could be related to statutory inspections, things like lifting equipment and pressure systems. All these things, some permit reporting has been changed, so that might, but there's still a requirement for statutory inspections. In certain sectors, there's different requirements for inspections that have been delayed slightly from the COVID-19 MOTs, and vehicle inspections and stuff have been revised slightly for certain sectors. So goods and services that are being supplied internationally, then the organisation needs to identify any new compliance obligations for that country in which they provide them. So basically, if you're going into Europe, for example, not everywhere now currently under this COVID-19 event is doing the same thing. So there will be different requirements. Transport and logistics has a different requirement in France, etc. And that's an ever-changing, updating profile. So depending on the service sector and the way, you need to make sure that you're aware of what's required for the various countries and the locations that you're delivering your service and product into. And an organisation needs to suitably assess the working arrangements, both on and off-site, for their workers as they're returning. So it may be revised working practices, shielding, hygiene regimes, etc., etc. All these things need to be considered before you start bringing people back onto your sites, because it needs to be in place and effectively in place prior to restarting your operations. Next slide, please. Risk assessments and associated working practices will have to have some documentation, and they'll need to be revised and communicated and effectively deployed. And this, again, coming back to the communications, this workforce consultation and engagement process is really critical. People are more likely to abide by something that they've had input to and agree with in principle. So it's really important to get the buy-in at an early stage as you're revising and developing these things as you go. Some things you won't foresee, and you'll have to revise them actually when, none of us are perfect. There'll be improvements that will take place as and when people return to work. Some will, we need one of these, or we need to do that. It'd be something that you haven't considered. And it's being open to that suggestion and making sure that you engage with the workforce and make sure arrangements are in place. This also applies to site visitors and suppliers and subcontractors. How will they be managed? How will they have access to the site? Do they need to come to site? Also consider things like delivery drivers. There's still a welfare provision requirement for delivery drivers. They still need to, have suitable welfare provision. It's all right saying, well, they're not our employees, but they are out on the road all the time. They do visit sites, and they may need to use certain facilities and have hygiene arrangements in place that are accessible to them. You've got to ensure that your organisation's change management process being effectively utilised and capture and realise all the necessary changes. This is not saying that you need to document every minor change that you make, but it's about making considerations and making things appropriate and effectively implementing them, because that's what delivering success is all about. Next slide, please. There's a lot of guidance available to us both in the UK and in various other locations, so Ireland and various things. I think the thing to remember here is that requirements will change depending on your location, certainly within the UK. All the various different countries have their own source and interpretation of requirements. So we've copied out there some guidance points that you can use from government websites, etc. But there'll also be trade associations, as we mentioned earlier. So you can get a lot of guidance and support from a lot of different areas in this. Thank goodness for the World Wide Web in some ways. Next slide, please. So some health and safety considerations. The government in the UK has looked at these and prepared some guidance for various sectors, and there they are: retail, construction, food sector, manufacturing and processing, logistics, outdoor businesses, farming, fishing and offshore work, cargo shipping and other long-term offshore work, transport businesses and waste management. All these things and guidance is available from the UK governments. Also, in relation to COVID-19, if it's contracted due to occupational activities, it is required to be reported under RIDO. If you need any further clarification, by all means, in the UK, visit the HSE website. Next slide, please. Waste management guidance, because obviously as things are developing, there's a lot of changes in terms of waste management and waste guidance. The actual way of handling waste is slightly changed, the various things going on there. So in the various locations throughout the UK, there's some pointers for information. Like I say, an NQA ourselves also do some coronavirus legislation updates, which may be useful to you if you haven't got enough already to read. So next slide, please. Support sections, who will be returning to work, you need to consider, will it be a full-blown return, will it be a phased return, will anybody be working remotely, or will just some people be, all these things, how it applies to you. Does the organisation have sufficient effective channels of communication? Like I say, this is really a key point of any change process. They obviously must be clearly communicated to the relevant parties, both internally and externally, and look at things like the infrastructure. Things like social distancing, moves around, different traffic routes, different pedestrian routes, one-way systems, staggered break times, smoking arrangements, etc. All these things will need to be considered within your workplace. Does all the workforce have the necessary competence for their need for the new work? Will they need training? Will they need additional information and instruction? What resources are needed? How you're going to train them? How you're going to deliver that training? How are the details and effectiveness going to be deployed and assessed? Think about all that. Is it revised documentation, training sessions, etc., toolbox talks? Some of it will be simple and straightforward stuff, but it's also about changing behaviour. We need to change the behaviour within the workplace. A lot of us are accustomed to not social distancing, and social distancing now is becoming the new norm, isn't it? So we need to ensure that we change behaviour, not just write a load of working practices, but actually effectively change behaviour for individuals whilst they're at work. Next slide, please. So suitable information and security and physical security arrangements being reviewed. This is quite an important thing as you've revised working practices and traffic routes and this and that and the other, and access points. You may be using access points that you didn't normally use. You Are they suitably secure? As and when? Do you need to implement more controls in certain places? Do you need to limit the amount of people that are going into a particular area? A hot topic here is obviously suitable and sufficient PPE and hygiene products being available and used effectively. So have you got enough welfare facilities of hand washing? Have you got a supply and continue being able to replenish that supply of PPE products and hygiene products as and when? These are all major considerations that you'd need to facilitate. Again, training facilities and provided for employees on new measures. So it may seem very simple, you know, but if you're requiring people to wear, let's say, surgical type gloves, the putting on and removing of said gloves needs to be done a particular way to prevent cross-contamination. So it's about training people in changing behaviours in terms of what they have to do, because a lot of this is quite new to most of us in normal society. Keeping staff updated and communicated is really important. There's, you know, we all hear of things that, you know, people don't normally talk to us, and that's the biggest criticism. It's all right working here, but nobody talks to us. Remember the communication and the effective methods of that. Also consider things like food storage. People are not going to be able to nip out at lunchtime and go and get whatever, or they may not have canteen facilities as they previously had. You may need to look at food storage arrangements, cleaning facilities, cleaning practices, additional hand sanitizing of door rails and all that sort of stuff. These are all the sort of considerations that you need to look at. Also, on the health and well-being arrangements, dealing with stress and anxiety of people returning to work. People can be preoccupied if they've got some family member or relative that's not very well. They may be under additional anxiety because of domestic circumstances, which has the potential to impact them whilst they're at work. So think about all that. How's the organisation going to deal with, firstly identify that and help support individuals through the process. General requirements, going back to service provision, you need to recalibrate equipment and various devices as part of your startup processes. All that will need to be put in place to make sure you're getting the right product out of the process at the end. Consider statutory and LOLA and pressure systems, as we mentioned earlier. Think of that may be required before you return to using that particular piece of kit or equipment. Next slide, please. Have all the processes been confirmed as safe to use before you go into operation? Also consider things like pre-use checks. Is everything working? We all know that plant and equipment and process lines have a tendency, you leave them on a Friday and you come back to them on Monday and miraculously something's gone wrong, or there's a leak or whatever on the Monday morning. So go through a lot of pre-use checks, visual checks, checking emergency stops and guards and all this type of thing, which should be the norm, but you maybe have to be more vigilant because you may have been exposed to a prolonged stop and it may not be evident, and you don't want to find out that an emergency stop doesn't work when you actually have an emergency. So it's really important to do those checks. A lot of considerations in terms of environmental for restarting your processes, special waste or emissions. You may have to drain processes or whatever. It may create unusual waste lines that you wouldn't normally encompass. If you're operating under permit conditions, shutdowns or whatever, how do you know that the permit conditions are being met when you restart your process? Or your restarting your process could create abnormal situations for you. Some special arrangements are in place within the UK for relating to COVID-19 waste requirements, and there's a special European waste code that's been set up for that, but you check out whether that's appropriate to you. We're not saying it is, but if you need to use that, that's one indicator that you may need to clarify. Regulating bodies have given examples of short-term attendance of site, etc., technically competent. So there's all sort of variations there going on in various sectors about permit requirements that have been exempted for a short period. And I think they apply to various industries. Like I said, there's already one for logistics and MOTs and various things. So it's a good way of thinking about these, but be prepared because they may be revised at short notice and we could get back to, and I use the phrase normal operating in various ways, and the new revised regulations could apply. The same applies to exemptions. A lot of exemptions and stuff has been put in place for the operations and may need to be revised quite quickly because it could be withdrawn at relatively short notice. So, next slide, please. How and when will processes, products and services be validated for startup? Do your customers have any special requirements relating to validation or products? Certain industry sectors have special, they won't just accept, oh, we've restarted our process, so it's just like it was before. They'll want a full validation process in certain sectors. How would projects that were placed on hold during the shutdown be restarted? Is it practical? Can they still be achieved? Will you need new arrangements that affect your manufacturing processes or service provision? There are also new requirements. It might be revised requirements for packaging and labelling. International deliveries have been affected, delivery times, etc. Supply lines have also been affected. Next slide, please. Has the outbreak affected the client's supply chain? So you as as users of suppliers and various things, your normal supply might have been 3 days. You might find now that it's 3 weeks, depending on what that is. So you need to reaffirm that your supply, how will that be impact on your business? Have you actually talked to your suppliers as you're planning to come back to work, what you need and how you need it, etc., etc. Existing materials and products and substances and stock, has it been spoiled during the shutdown? Is it still fit for purpose? Is it still fit for use? Only you can answer that for your individual organisations. Will post-delivery activities be affected during the outbreak? So you may well have done certain things prior to the outbreak, but you may not be appropriate to do them during the outbreak. So think about all of that. Will the startup of processes create additional non-conforming products? How will that be managed? That could put a lot of strain onto storage facilities, etc., disposal routes. So think about that in terms of, will alternative requirements or alternative resources be required for that? Next slide, please. Going into section 9, so this is the performance evaluation elements. Are all your measures and you need to monitor and measure your performance, are they all in place? We talked briefly earlier about internal audits, a suitable tool it's a very good tool, but there will be others. So you need to think about what's appropriate for your organisation and set priorities to ensure that you don't want to be producing 1,000 widgets that are all out of spec or whatever, or a service that doesn't meet requirements of you interested parties. This is really what it's about. This performance evaluation is obviously critical. In terms of environmental considerations, meter readings before startup, time frame for monitoring emissions, etc. Some exemptions and what a relaxation is in place. However, do they apply to you? Do they apply to your sector? How quickly can you implement it if it was withdrawn, the exemption was withdrawn? Think of those things. So you need to be prepared. Next slide, please. There we go. Is it business as usual? We need to make improvements as we go. Nobody's perfect. Nobody can foresee everything from the get-go. There wouldn't be such a thing as continual improvement if we couldn't get better. So we're already good. We want to get better. We want to be the best. So make improvements as we go, as you see necessary, and wherever they're possible. Don't be frightened of implementing some change for an improvement, but consider the risks and hazards associated with that improvement before you implement the change. That would be my guidance there. So there we go.
Right, thanks for that, Terry. a lot of information there. Hope it's given you all some food for thought and made you aware of some things that you may need to consider when you start planning your return to work that maybe you'd not thought of before. And one of the things which I mentioned at the beginning, which NQA has produced, is our new COVID secure guideline verification product. And what is this? It's a product which we've done to support our purpose to build trust and support risk management in supply chains with consumers and wider stakeholders. It's there to help and support the country to return to work safely. It's an independent verification, so it's not something that you're doing on yourself in-house. This is NQA coming and reviewing your organization's arrangements on a site-specific basis against the applicable government guidelines to let you know how well prepared you are for returning to work, for keeping everybody safe. And it has multiple benefits to mitigate or reduce the risk of transmission of COVID-19, which is something we're all really keen on. It demonstrates your duty of care as an employer. Will give reassurance to your employees that the arrangements that you've put in place on their behalf to keep them safe and let them go home safe at the end of the day are effective. Reassure your customers that what you're doing is in line with the government's guidelines, and when achieved, it's very positive PR for the world in general, for your organization. So COVID secure guideline verification, it's been in place now for a few weeks, and if you want additional information, as with all things, it's available on our website. We've produced sector-specific criteria applicable per country. The UK criteria for the COVID secure guidelines is the government's guidelines, which are published on that website there, gov.uk, and those guidelines are industry specific, and they're following the identification of the hazard, the assessment of the risk, and the controls that are in place today to mitigate those risks. And there's general criteria which apply to all organisations. You can see them listed there: PPE, social distancing, cleaning, hygiene, management of the workforce, all things that we've spoken at length during this webinar. And then sector-specific criteria: construction, factories, laboratories, offices, people's homes, restaurants, shops, vehicles. So the guidelines that we have in place can assess the requirements in each of those specific industries. So if you're looking for more information on COVID Secure, please visit the NQA website. So returning to work safely, using your management system to do so. What we've been through here is not an exhaustive list. It's not specific to any one industry or organization. And so obviously you'll have to take the points that we've given you and apply them to your own specific arrangements. There may well be other elements that we've not spoken about today that can impact your organization. So please be aware of those. Please familiarise yourself with the government guidance that's applicable to yourself and any new legal requirements. Earlier on in this webinar, we put some useful links on there to help you find out what the new legal requirements are. And we'd very much like to wish you all good luck for returning to work. Hope you can all do so safely. Hope you can all do so effectively. And we hope that NQA can be there to support you and work with you all in the very near future. So that's everything from us today, and we come to the Q&A section. So if anybody has any questions or comments, then now's the time to post them in the chat window. Okay, so there's nothing in there. So I guess we must have satisfied your needs with what we've been through today. As I said at the beginning, this webinar is recorded. These slides and a link to the recording of the webinar will be emailed out to everybody that's attended today. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. Hope this has proved useful, and yeah, we hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you all. Cheers.